Good morning. I'm excited to be here today and to help kick off the birth through 12th grade water cooler conference. I want to start echoing Camille by thanking the staff at the Advancement Project California for the important role you play in convening education advocates, researchers, policymakers, funders, organizers, practitioners, and others to discuss key education issues and priorities. I also want to acknowledge the important work of researchers and analysts with PACE, the Getting Down to Facts 2 Research Project, AIR, WestEd, and the California Budget and Policy Center, as well as the team at EdSource for their work to make complex research understandable and actionable. I'll be drawing from these sources in my presentation today on education funding in California, looking at how far we've come and how far we still need to go. So let's start with some good news. After multiple years of significant budget cuts during the Great Recession, California has spent the last 7 years reinvesting. This slide shows the growth in Proposition 98 spending since 2012, made possible in large part by the passage of Proposition 30 and later, in 2016, Proposition 55. It's important to note that beginning in 2013, K-12 dollars go to schools and districts through the local control funding formula. That means in addition to base funding for all districts, districts receive additional funds for every student from a low-income family, in foster care, or who is an English learner. Districts with high concentrations of these students, that's 55% or more, get an additional 50% in per pupil spending. In short, we've both deepened our investment and distributed resources in a more equitable way to districts throughout the state. And there's evidence that those investments are beginning to shift practices and result in expanded services and supports for students who are explicitly identified in LCFF. For example, more than 3/4 of superintendents surveyed said that LCFF has enabled their district to improve services and programs for students from low-income families, English learners, and foster youth. This is from a 2018 report by the Local Control Funding Formula Research Collaborative, and you'll find access to all of their studies on the PACE website. Leaders in relatively larger districts and districts with high unduplicated and English learner counts were significantly more likely to express this belief. There's also evidence that the increased investment, more equitably spent, is having a positive effect on student outcomes. This slide is taken from the LPI and Getting Down to Facts 2 study by Rucker Johnson and Sean Tanner, entitled Money and Freedom, the Impact of California School Finance Reform. It shows that increases in per pupil spending distributed under LCFF led to significant increases in high school graduation rates. For example, the study found that every $1 increase in per pupil revenue for students in grades 10 through 12 was associated with a 6 percentage point increase in high school graduation rates on average. The red line in this graph represents the increase in graduation rates in districts with large spending increases. The same report also finds that increases in per pupil spending improved math and reading test scores, particularly for Latinx students and students from low-income families. Specifically for students from low-income families, the researchers found that a $1,000 increase in district per pupil spending during ages 13 through 16 increased 11th grade math scores by the equivalent of approximately 7 months of learning. That same spending increase during ages 13 through 16 was associated with an increase in 11th grade reading scores, equivalent to approximately 3 months of learning. Now, it's important to pause for a minute. This is not to say that test scores or achievement generally are where they should be. They're not, particularly for students from low-income families, English learners, and students of color. What it does tell us, though, is that more money, more equitably spent, has had a positive impact on achievement and graduation rates. It's also important to add that continued improvement is not guaranteed. To sustain and deepen those gains, we must also sustain and deepen investments over time. So that's the positive news. We're investing more and more equitably, and those investments are beginning to have an impact both on opportunities and on student outcomes. But that's only part of the story, because while we're spending more, $23 billion more in ongoing funds to schools and districts through LCFF, there's evidence that in real dollars, school funding has been relatively flat, particularly in the last few years. This chart from the California Budget and Policy Center of inflation-adjusted per pupil spending over time illustrates this trend. This relatively flat level of funding coincides with significant increases in costs for districts, particularly in the areas of healthcare, education, special education, pensions, declining enrollment, facilities, and attracting and retaining teachers. In fact, these rising costs are creating what the authors of a recent West Ed report have described as a silent recession. There's also evidence that even with the increase, the state is spending far less than researchers say we need. In another Getting Down to Facts study, researchers found that while the gap between current and so-called adequate funding is smaller than when it was studied last in 2006, it's still significant. Specifically, they estimate that in 2016-17, the state would have needed to spend roughly $26 billion more to ensure that every student had the opportunity to meet the standards the state has established for what students should know and be able to do when they graduate from high school. So $26 billion, that's a big number. Let's break it down with a few examples of what that gap looks like at the district level. The next 4 charts I want to note are from a new EdSource Interactive, and if you haven't explored it yet, I would encourage you to do so. The quick headline, as you'll see in some examples this morning, is that actual spending per pupil in most districts is far below the adequate cost. So, some examples. First, LA Unified. LAUSD would have needed to spend $20,000 per pupil to provide students with an adequate education. That's 38% more than what the district spent in 2016-17, or roughly equivalent to the estimated spending gap statewide. In Fresno, the predicted cost of providing students with an adequate education was roughly $18,500 in 2016-17, compared to the roughly $12,500 the district was spending. That's an increase, or a gap, of 47%. In the Gilroy Unified School District, there is a 69% gap between the predicted cost of an adequate education and the district's 2016-17 spending level per pupil. And in the West Contra Costa Unified School District, there's a 76% gap between the district's actual spending in 2016-17 and the predicted cost of an adequate education, which was roughly $22,000 per pupil. You get the idea. The amount of the gap varies across districts, but in most cases, the current spending doesn't match the predicted level for adequacy. I say most cases because in some higher wealth districts, the per pupil spending is actually higher than the adequacy level. And that ongoing gap between high wealth and low wealth districts undermines the commitment to equity that's central to LCFF and that will also be critical to the success of all students. It should come as no surprise then that more than 3/4 of superintendents surveyed reported that an inadequate base funding is a barrier to improving teaching and learning in their district. This concern about fiscal equity was more common among superintendents in relatively larger districts, but district leaders across the board said their base funds were not sufficient to do all that they're expected to do. Part of that all that districts are expected to do increasingly extends beyond academic support to whole child support, such as physical and mental health services. These are particularly important in California, where families navigate a host of structural challenges, from the rising cost of housing that's displacing low-income families and families of color, to the lack of secure and living wage employment or affordable health care. Inadequate levels of state funding play out in this arena as well. California ranks at or near the bottom of all states in terms of the percentage of K-12 public school students with school-based access to health care or mental health care. This slide from Getting Down to Facts 2 study shows the limited access to physical health care. Less than 20% of first graders have access to school-based health care. The percentage increases, but not by much, by the time students reach 12th grade, where 30% have access to physical health care. For school nurses, California ranked 39th in 2012, with approximately 2,240 students for each nurse. For school counselors, California ranks last among 50 states, with approximately 1,000 students per counselor. Now, so far my comments have focused on K-12 spending, but the need is as great in early learning, and our failure to invest in the youngest learners has a deep and lasting impact on student success in K-12. The dotted blue line in this graph shows the drop in ECE funding during the Great Recession and the relative flat funding through 2016-17. We've recovered and even gone beyond pre-recession spending, particularly with recent investments. Funding, however, is still inadequate to address the need. Let's look at that need and compare it to access to ECE in California. Well, we're actually making progress on 4-year-olds, with 69% of eligible children enrolled. Some places like Los Angeles, with its expanded transitional kindergarten program, and San Francisco, with Preschool for All, are serving an even greater portion of children. But just 38% of eligible 3-year-olds and only 14% of eligible infants and toddlers are currently being served. And care for these youngest children is extremely expensive. A single parent earning minimum wage spends over half of her income on infant and toddler care. The gap between need and availability have led many to say that the lack of high quality and affordable infant and toddler care has reached crisis conditions. So where do we go from here? Well, the research is clear around the need for deeper investments from birth through K-12 and for those funds to be equitably and strategically spent. LPI's recent positive outliers study found that districts that are doing an exceptional job at advancing opportunities and improving outcomes for Black, Latinx, and white students are doing so in part by making strategic investments, particularly in a strong and stable educator workforce. And there's an important role for the state to play in this area as well. California has made a significant down payment in the last few years to address teacher shortages, and there's still more work to be done to ensure that every student, particularly those furthest from opportunity, is taught by a fully prepared and supported teacher. In addition to that increased funding overall, other areas of significant and targeted need besides ECE include special education and facilities. Here too, the state has begun to make inroads and deeper investments are still needed. I'd like to end by also suggesting that the path forward also must include focused attention on authentic engagement of students, families, educators, and communities. Engagement is a cornerstone of LCFF. California is a leader, in fact, in prioritizing engagement as part of its theory of change and understanding that our schools are stronger and our students are better served when all stakeholders are engaged and partnering in their success. Here too, the research and the lived experience probably of many in this room tells us that there's a gap between our aspirations and our current reality. Authentic engagement, creating a shared vision of student and school success, and understanding the current barriers to achieving that vision will also be key to building the public understanding and the political will that will be critical to reaching sustained levels of adequate and equitable funding. And that in part is what this water cooler is about, building our collective knowledge and stimulating the conversation and action needed to support students and educators. So before we move on to the rest of our time together, I want to invite you to take a minute and have a conversation with your neighbor. Where are you seeing examples of progress towards equity in opportunity and improved outcomes? And where are you still seeing challenges stemming from insufficient funding? You'll have about 5 minutes to share. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the convening.